As I indicated yesterday from the pulpit of St. James Parish, I'm not one for scripts. And so last night at the sermon, you got the results of that. Knowing that there would be a script today and that much of what we've done has been scripted. In preparing these remarks, this address, I've had in mind that these words will really only be part of a fuller message at convention that includes the things I said yesterday morning and my sermon last night and the things that others have said and other conversations that have happened. So I don't have the intent of this address being something that will address all questions, all issues, all ideas, and do it completely. But instead, it's actually kind of pointed, I think. So let me offer it, and I hope it's received well. As I have approached the task of writing this address to convention, I found myself contemplating the ancient Greek myth of Sisyphus. Some of you will get that right away, but let me explain. In life, Sisyphus was the founding king of a nation later to be known as Corinth, who was remembered as greedy, deceitful, and cruel, killing travelers and guests rather than showing them hospitality. After cheating the gods in his lifetime, Sisyphus was then punished by Zeus after his death. Sisyphus was condemned to roll a large stone up a steep hill. Before he could ever reach the top, Zeus would cause the stone to roll back to the bottom, and Sisyphus would be forced to start over again. Day after day, for all of eternity, this pattern would be repeated. Across the generations since, interpreters of this myth have held Sisyphus up as a model of the never-ending and futile nature of human endeavor. More recently, in this past century, French philosopher Albert Camus wrote of Sisyphus as a hero of the absurd. It's not that uncommon for some of us to feel, from time to time at least, that our efforts are never-ending, futile, and even absurd. Each morning we rise from our beds to spend the day working. When the day is over and we lay down our heads to sleep, we may or may not feel that we have made significant progress towards our goals. Then the next morning we rise and start over again. It is not difficult to imagine that many find such routines to be mind-numbing and leading to a deep sense of hopelessness. Over time, even the rhythms of church life can begin to resemble such routines. When this happens and we begin to feel that our efforts have become clouded with hopelessness or even absurdity, and our life together is little different than that found in the world around us, is it any wonder that others are not jumping to join our Christian communities? Somehow, when this becomes our reality, I imagine the Apostle Paul saying these words to us, which he first wrote to the church in Corinth. If for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. My friends, I want to say to you today that this world does not get the last word. Our hope does not rest in the possibility that one day we might finally manage to get the rock to the top of the hill. No, our hope rests in Christ Jesus, who died for our sins, was buried, and who was raised on the third day. In baptism, we die with Christ, and we are raised with Christ. Our proclamation does not rest in our own worthiness, nor in our ability to conquer our own mountains, but in God's love for us in Jesus. Over the years that I've been your bishop, some of you have heard me affirm that the Christian gospel proclaims a message of death and resurrection and not a message of immortality, even if some of our actions might seem to say otherwise. Too often we seem determined to preserve status quo, even when evidence would suggest the need for a change. This year in my address, I will identify two areas of life and ministry in our diocese that I believe would benefit from some changed and new practices. One of the greatest challenges that we face in East Carolina grows out of the perception that there is a shortage of clergy across the Episcopal Church. Let me begin by sharing some current statistics from within our own diocese. With assistance from the Reverend Michael Singer, our interim transition ministry officer, I've categorized our 67 congregations into 4 groups. 22 of our congregations have a settled priest serving as rector or priest in charge on a full-time basis, and some of these congregations have assisting clergy. 13 of our congregations have a priest serving on a regular part-time basis. 14 of our congregations are actively searching for their next priest, whether for a full-time or a part-time position. 18 of our congregations are currently dependent upon available supply clergy. This means that slightly more than half of our congregations, just 52%, have a settled full-time or part-time priest currently in place. And just less than half of our congregations, 48%, are facing some level of clergy transition or clergy shortage. To be clear, these numbers are always shifting in one direction or another. While those of us who live in eastern North Carolina appreciate the many blessings that God has given us in this beautiful slice of creation, congregations seeking their next priest faced significant challenges, including these. It is difficult to attract clergy willing to relocate for part-time work. There are far fewer clergy seeking new positions than there are congregations seeking new clergy, thus giving clergy many choices across the whole country. Some of our congregations struggle to offer compensation packages that compete favorably with congregations in other parts of the diocese or the country. But let me add to that those compensation packages, though they may not compete well broadly, are often very generous relative to the income in the communities where the priest would be called to serve. Offering employee-only health insurance does not always compare favorably to full family coverage that's offered in other places. Not all regions of our diocese offer viable options for a clergy spouse seeking employment. Housing is not always available as needed. Education and healthcare options can be less attractive than in other regions of our diocese or our country. These are some of the things we hear as we work with congregations and their search committees who are seeking a new priest or seeking a priest. Even in the face of these challenges and others, we will continue to work hard to attract clergy willing to serve in the congregations of our diocese, whether on a full-time or part-time basis. Where congregations are willing, we will seek clergy called to serve a regional grouping of smaller congregations. We will continue to be dependent upon and grateful for the willing service of faithful retired clergy, many of whom are here with us today. And I would like the retired clergy in our midst to stand. I warned some of them I would be doing something like this. Thank you to all of you. Michael, I might get the numbers a little bit off, but am I right that the Reverend Jim Lupton, who is well into his 80s, was doing multiple services on Christmas Eve this year, just to make sure that churches would be able to worship on Christmas Eve? At the same time as we continue to work hard in the ways that we are already working, it is my conviction that we must eagerly embrace 2 particular changed and new practices. First, we must continue to encourage individuals who will ultimately choose to follow traditional paths of formation for priestly ministry and then serve in full-time ministries of the church. But we must also find ways to encourage individuals to step forward who believe themselves called to lay and ordain ministries that will be expressed while they continue to live and work in the communities where they are already well-rooted. Those following this second path could be described as being engaged in bivocational ministry. Skip Walker and I used to tease that he was involved in about 4 different things. So how do you go from bivocational to quadvocational? In order that the congregations of this diocese will have the lay and ordained leadership that we need, we must be creative in offering multiple paths of formation for those whom God is calling. As congregations and as dioceses, we need to more overtly affirm this understanding of call, while working together to provide opportunities for individuals to engage in the sort of discernment that allows them to better understand whether they are called to a lay, diaconal, or priestly ministry. Our Commission on Ministry has made a good beginning at this through their offering of a vocational discernment event called The Path. I hope that they will continue to offer opportunities like this and that more individuals will participate over time. The Commission on Ministry will also need to continue to strengthen its capacity for supporting the discernment and formation of individuals who are called to bivocational ministry. We all need to be willing to go home from convention and begin the prayerful work of inviting one another into the sorts of conversations that will encourage people to understand that God might be calling them or you to ministries that they or you have not previously imagined, and then support each other on the journey of discernment and formation. I have seen in other parts of our church, and I understand that in this diocese, more perhaps in the past, we have benefited from the witness and ministry of people who have been both priests and teachers. People like Drew at St. Paul's again in Greenville, who spends most of his days being a physician, but also exercises his ministry as a priest in the midst of congregational life. Those are the kinds of creative possibilities we need to imagine. I think most deacons would argue that by nature of their vocation, they are bivocational. They're always engaged in something else besides the work of deacon, even if those two sets of things are intimately connected. And we can all look at people in our own lives who have so deeply lived into their call, their vocation as a layperson, so as to see their career or their profession or their job as the thing that simply supports them in order to do that thing to which they believe themselves really called. We'll need to have some room for some creativity and some imagination. And I think that yesterday Mary Parker spoke about the power of creativity and imagination. The second way I'd like us to embrace change and new practices is in something about which I've been speaking for a while, and that's in the launching of our School for Ministry. I would argue that at the same time as we do this work of discernment, we need to implement a plan to launch a diocesan school of ministry early in 2021. This is not a new idea. I've spoken of the need for a school of ministry for a number of years and in a number of addresses. In the past, however, I've understood that this would be the work of our Commission on Ministry, and while we've had many conversations around that table about such a possibility, I now understand that this work needs to take place separately from the Commission, but with their support and in coordination with their work. To that end, and after some wide consultation, I've been collecting the names of individuals who are eager to work towards the launching of this school. Others who are interested in this work should connect with Hannah Jarman at Diocesan House so that they can be invited to our first team meeting to be called soon after convention has ended. Building on the model of our existing school for deacons, we will similarly develop a school for lay ministry and a school for priests, all within the one school for ministry. This model will include partnering with Episcopal seminaries and others for high-quality academic elements. At present, for example, we have 2 individuals studying at ACTS, the Alternative Clergy Training at Sewanee program. Greg Smith of St. Andrew's Goldsboro is engaged in formation toward ordination as a priest. Rhonda Thomas of St. James Parish, Wilmington, is engaged in formation toward ordination as a deacon. Their time at Sewanee includes 2 weeks in the classroom in January and then again in June, with online work with their professors and classmates between these sessions in residence. Other options are available to us, of course, as well. Besides this program at Sewanee, we will explore them all. Some, like the Iona program, hosted by the Seminary of the Southwest, would allow us to offer much of the academic work here in the communities of our diocese, without travel or residency involved. For those being formed for leadership in lay ministry, I would also expect that all academics would be offered here locally in the diocese. Besides academic work, which would happen locally at a distance or online, we would also work to provide the spiritual and practical formation that would be a part of this training here at home in the diocese, with plans to continue using Trinity Center as a regular gathering place. While there is a perception that the Episcopal Church is experiencing a clergy shortage in our diocese and beyond, messages of scarcity like this one do not tell the whole story. I firmly believe, and you've heard me say this before, that God provides for the church all that the church needs to engage in God's mission in the world. We need to have eyes that can see where God is leading us, and especially where God might be at work doing new things. And we need to have hearts that are open to taking the risks involved in following God's lead. I'd now like to give my attention to a second area of our diocesan life and ministry that I believe would benefit from change and new practices. There are many days when I am convinced that our diocesan structures need a serious overhaul. I'm sure that I've said this on other occasions. While I don't think of my work as your bishop as being absurd or even futile, it is certainly never ending. Perhaps it is this experience that leads me to contemplate the myth of Sisyphus so regularly. Each year at this time, I am reminded of how many diocesan committees and boards are populated largely by my nomination. Some of these are committees without clear or current mandates, or with mandates that overlap those of others in the diocese. I'm certainly convinced that our diocesan canons need a careful review and rewriting in order that our structures of governance better suit the work that God calls us to do. And in extra words, I would say, so that we are a less top-heavy organization and have more time for things that we might think to be more important. At its last meeting, our Executive Council considered charters that had been drafted by 5 of our diocesan life ministries. By reflecting on these charters together in one meeting, our council members were able to see the competing and conflicting assumptions held by ministry leaders about how our diocese functions and to whom they believe themselves to be accountable for their work. Executive Council will continue this work at its retreat in early March with the goal of better coordinating and supporting the ministries of our diocese, and as a part of leading the members of our diocese in the clarification of our mission priorities. As I described yesterday morning, our diocesan house staff has continued to work through near continuous change. In 2019 alone, we said goodbye to 3 valued team members. Canon Matt Stockard retired in the spring, Beth Nagy left for other employment in the fall, and Canon Sonny Brown's position was eliminated at the end of the year. Beth's position has been filled this week by Melissa Grady, and we are currently searching for the person who will provide leadership as our canon for diocesan life and leadership. Those staff members who continue have seen their roles and responsibilities shifted and changed, and I know that this has added stress in their lives as people who were already working very hard on our behalf. I am grateful to Matt, Beth, and Sonny, who no longer work with us, and to Latanya, Patricia, Jimmy, Emily, Lindsay, Fred, Michael, and Hannah, who continue to work so hard in support of the life and ministry of the Diocese of East Carolina. I'm also grateful to the members of our Diocese's Personnel Committee for their efforts in helping us to clarify job descriptions and compensation standards for the diocesan house staff. They will be reporting to the Executive Council on this work in the months to come. My work as your bishop involves facing a wide variety of expectations that come from many different directions. Amongst other things, this means that there is always work that needs but does not get my proper attention. And sometimes the determination of that is different in my eyes than in the eyes of the one who comes to me with the expectations. Do you all experience that? Being approached by folks who really believe that the thing that they've got and the need that they can see is got to be the top of the list. One of my experiences as a parish priest is the blessing of having served very small churches and some much larger churches. And the reality of life in those places is incredibly and dramatically different. And the way that we function together as church is different in each of those settings. There's not one way to be church that works in all of the different ways that we are church in the Diocese of East Carolina. As a diocese, sometimes I think we can get so deeply confused because sometimes we'll hear expectations about how we can be in relation to our largest congregations, which in some cases have staff and budget and resources greater than the diocese. And at other times, we're asked to come along and support congregations who are working so hard to keep their doors open and to serve their community and just need some help. In the interests of full transparency, my responsibilities as Chancellor of the University of the South have been far more demanding this year than I could ever have imagined. As some of you know, the university is currently engaged in searching for its next Vice Chancellor and President, its next Chaplain and Dean of All Saints Chapel, and its next Dean of the School of Theology. What are the chances that all three incumbents would choose to retire at the same time? As Chancellor, my participation in these searches has been expected, and I have participated to the best of my abilities, using a mix of personal time and work time for the additional travel to Tennessee and back. The best news is that in the midst of these realities is that we're getting closer to the end of the search processes, and my work as Chancellor there will therefore return to more normal levels. And just so you know, I'm going to decree that those whom we hire will stay in their respective positions at least until after my term as Chancellor comes to an end. I'm glad you laughed. I have not spoken of our diocesan structures or of my work as a bishop with the goal of impressing you with how hard I work. I know that most everyone in this room could tell the story from the perspective of their own lives about what life is like. I have tried to be one of those ordained people who never argues about how tough it is, because I've always worked with people who work so hard to provide for family, to keep serious and difficult jobs going, or to live without employment. Neither have I tried to convince you that it is impossible for our diocese to do the work that God has given us to do. Instead, this has all been a lead-up, essentially, to three recommendations I'd like to offer. First, for a time, let's lay down some of the burdens of our diocesan structures and find ways to give prayerful and careful consideration to how we might differently organize our common life. Related to this recommendation, I am asking that this year, membership on the annual committees of convention and on some other committees and boards be confirmed or elected on my nomination to the Executive Council rather than here at convention with you. And I'll say more about that when we get to that part of the agenda. A second recommendation, that Executive Council continues its good work of building right relationships with the various ministries of our diocesan life, in order to clarify such things as purpose, membership, and accountability with our existing ministries, and so that we might set clearer patterns for new ministry opportunities that could be explored. Some of you will have heard these observations from me early on in my time with you as bishop, but I soon learned that a good number of the ministries of our diocese, while perhaps active and engaged, in many cases functioned in isolation from other ministries of the diocese and in no apparent relationship with the structures of the diocese except somehow the bishop when they could get hold of me. And my experience from other settings is that just wasn't going to work. Diocesan ministries would not get the support they needed. We would get caught. We wouldn't have the opportunity to provide resources for other things, and we'd have ministries competing with one another for resources. Part of the work that Canon Sonny Brown has taken on during the time he was with us is to work with leaders of many of our diocesan life committees to move towards a place where we can be better coordinated in our common work and towards the work which the Executive Council has now picked up in building better, proper relationships between those who are engaged in the leadership of ministry and those who have to make decisions about mission priorities and resources. My last of the three recommendations is that our Executive Council, working with other diocesan leadership, design a process of discernment that would be launched at next year's convention to engage our wider diocese in gaining clarity with regards to these mission priorities for our life together. Gaining such clarity will allow us to better focus our resources of time, talent, and treasures. In some organizations, there's the expectation that a person who's in a position like the one I have would deliver the vision to the people and say, here's what we're going to do, and then watch and see when it doesn't happen. My experience more is that vision is something that God can give to any one of us, and therefore processes of vision discernment in Christian community need to be prayerful and inclusive and take enough time to allow that all voices be heard. Executive Council reflected on that possibility, a discernment process such as I've described, as something we would have launched this year, but for a number of reasons, which I won't get into now, at this moment at least, agreed that it would make more sense to work this year to be able to launch it at convention and then continue that work with the hope that we might even be able to get far enough into it that we would have good input in setting priorities for the budget year that would follow. We are still essentially working with mission priorities that were expressed in the materials that you developed as a diocese when you found yourself searching for your next bishop. And it may be that some of those priorities are still true and still need our attention. I would argue that there are lots of other ways that we can use the resources God has given us to build up the life of this diocese in our congregations and in our common ministries together. And I want to do that work of discernment with you. So are you all still awake? I hope so. I fully understand that the work I have described and the recommendations I have offered are not the sort of material that all other people find deeply fascinating. But this material is, however, the stuff of new wineskins. Do you remember these words of Jesus? And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and so are the skins. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. If we are to be able to bear the new wine of God's ever-new creation, then we need always be attentive to letting go of habits, patterns, and structures that prevent us from being able to do the work we are called to do in our own time. Later this year, after I have returned from the Lambeth Conference in August, I will take my first sabbatical in more than 20 years. Now you're hearing one of the reasons why the discernment process will start next year. My last planned sabbatical was canceled when I found myself participating with the people of this diocese in the process of discernment that led you to call me as your bishop. This time of sabbatical will last for 3 months, with my return planned tentatively to take place a week or so after All Saints' Day in November. While some of my plans are still in development, the focus of my studies will be on the work and ministry of a bishop, with particular attention to what this will look like for me and for us in the next season of our life together in East Carolina. My sabbatical plans will also include time for rest and renewal. As the time draws closer, I will share more details. Members of the Standing Committee are working with our Chancellor and with me to sort out some of the practical details that will need attention. Therefore, one of the pieces of action we will consider in a little while with an amendment to one of our canons. While I am away, we will not be scheduling bishop visits on a weekly basis. You know, we could have hired another bishop to come and do that, but instead we're going to put those visits on hold while I'm away, and confirmations will need to be put on pause for 3 months. You have your advance warning now. If there are people with whom you are working with the hope that in September I was going to be there, well, let's just speed that up a little bit and arrange for me to come for a visit before the summer. Or we'll make plans for something that would happen as soon after I would return in the fall as was possible. I think that is all quite manageable. To be perfectly honest, I wake up almost every morning excited to be your bishop and to share with you in the work of being the church that God calls us to be. I still find myself incredibly surprised and humbled that God would have brought me to be with you for this purpose. In offering this address and the recommendations contained in it, I am recognizing that after almost 5.5 years together, it is time for us to explore again the gifts that God has given us for ministry and to refresh the structures of our common life in order that we can be more effective in serving the mission which God places before us. May God continue to bless us richly as we serve together as the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement in Eastern North Carolina. Amen.